You're no soldier, you're a shame. Those 7 words. 7 goddamn words that shattered everything I thought I knew about honor, about service, about the brotherhood that's supposed to hold when everything else falls apart. The Admiral said it with such calm precision, like he was discussing the weather or ordering his morning coffee. But that smirk. Christ, that smirk cut deeper than any shrapnel I've pulled from my body, deeper than any bullet that's ever kissed my flesh. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to rage like some Hollywood villain. No, he was far more calculating than that. He just reached out with those soft, desk-pushing hands of his and ripped my firearm from my grip right there in front of every man I'd bled beside, sweated beside, nearly died beside. The metal felt cold as it left my palm, but not as cold as the silence that followed. Not as cold as the eyes of my brothers who couldn't meet my gaze. The sound of that weapon hitting the ground still echoes in my skull. It wasn't just metal on concrete, it was my identity shattering, my purpose crumbling, my entire world collapsing into a heap of twisted steel and broken dreams. And he just walked away. Like I was nothing. Like 20 years of service meant less than the dirt on his polished boots. That night, lying in the darkness of my empty quarters, I learned something they don't teach you in any training manual. Silence can wound deeper than war itself. The screaming of artillery, the crack of rifles, the chaos of battle, none of that compares to the deafening quiet that follows when your own people turn their backs on you. When the flag you've served becomes a shroud for your shame. But sitting here now, knowing what I know, understanding what happened next, I had no idea my parents were already on their way to make that bastard regret every syllable he'd spat in my direction. Before I tell you what happened next, before I take you down this rabbit hole of betrayal and redemption that changed our base forever, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button, not because I'm begging for validation, but because this story needs to be heard. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened that night didn't just change me or my family or even that corrupt admiral. It changed the entire foundation of what we thought honor meant in the modern military. So buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about loyalty, justice, and the price of standing up to corruption in uniform. Picture this. The SEAL training ground stretched out under the harsh California sun, every flag snapping in the ocean breeze, like they were saluting the ghosts of warriors past. Medals gleamed on display boards, each one representing blood spilled, lives saved, missions completed against impossible odds. This was supposed to be hallowed ground. This was supposed to be sacred. The ceremony was meant to celebrate new promotions, good men earning their stripes, proving their worth through sweat and sacrifice. I was supposed to be standing proud among them, watching the next generation step into roles I'd helped prepare them for. Instead, I became the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you cross the wrong people in the wrong way. The Admiral took the podium with all the grace of a politician, his uniform pressed to perfection, his chest heavy with decorations that suddenly seemed more like costume jewelry than symbols of service. When he announced the disciplinary demotion, his voice carried across the assembled crowd like a death sentence. Every word was calculated, every pause deliberate. He wasn't just stripping my rank, he was performing an execution for the masses. Due to conduct unbecoming, he said, and I wanted to laugh at the irony. Conduct unbecoming? From the man who'd been falsifying reports for years, who'd left good soldiers to die because it was politically convenient, who'd built his career on the backs of better men than himself. But I couldn't laugh. I could barely breathe. He approached me with theatrical slowness, milking every second of my humiliation. The crowd watched in stunned silence. These were my brothers, my comrades, men who'd shared foxholes and nightmares with me. But fear is a powerful thing, and they all knew that speaking up would paint targets on their own backs. So they watched. They stayed silent. They let it happen. When his fingers wrapped around my service weapon, I felt something die inside me. This wasn't just a gun, it was the physical manifestation of my oath, my commitment, my identity as a protector of the innocent. It had been with me through 3 tours, countless operations, moments when it was the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. And now it was being stripped away like I was some kind of criminal. The metal sliding from my palm felt like losing a limb. The sound it made hitting the ground, that hollow, final clang, it echoed through my soul like a funeral bell. I stood there, motionless, my pride shattered but my spirit still clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Because deep down, beneath all the pain and humiliation, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. They say every soldier faces battle, but no one warned me that the first bullet could come from your own superior. No one prepared me for the possibility that the greatest enemy I'd ever face wouldn't be hiding in some foreign cave or desert bunker. He'd be wearing the same uniform, saluting the same flag, claiming to serve the same cause. The camera of my memory lingers on that moment. The Admiral's smirk as he held my weapon aloft like some kind of trophy, the sound of metal echoing off concrete, the faces of good men who were too afraid to stand up for what was right. And me, standing there like a statue, my world crumbling around me while I tried to maintain some shred of dignity in the face of absolute corruption. But you know what they say about hitting rock bottom, it gives you a solid foundation to build on. And I was about to learn that sometimes, when you can't fight for yourself, family steps in to remind everyone what honor really means. They sent me home like a diseased animal. Base clearance revoked with the efficiency of a bureaucratic machine designed to erase inconvenient truths. 20 years of service, of bleeding for this country, of sacrificing pieces of my soul on foreign soil, all of it wiped away with a few signatures and a plastic badge tossed in the trash. Cleaning out my locker was like attending my own funeral. Every photo, every letter from home, every small memento that had kept me sane during the darkest nights of deployment, all of it stuffed into cardboard boxes like evidence of a crime. The silence in that hallway was deafening. Men I'd trained with, fought beside, saved and been saved by, they walked past my open locker like it was radioactive. Eye contact was too dangerous. A nod of acknowledgement might be seen as taking sides. No one said goodbye. Not a single soul had the courage to shake my hand or offer a word of support. Fear had infected them all like a virus, and I was patient zero. The contagion of standing up to corruption was too risky for their careers, their families, their futures. So they let me pack in silence, let me walk those corridors alone for the last time, let me carry the weight of injustice on my shoulders without offering to help bear the load. The drive home felt like traveling through a wasteland. Every mile took me further from the life I'd known, from the purpose that had defined me since I was barely old enough to shave. The empty holster on my hip felt like a missing tooth. You can't stop tonguing the gap, can't ignore the absence, can't pretend everything's normal when such a fundamental part of you has been ripped away. But home was different. Home was where my aging parents waited, both of them retired military instructors who'd spent their lives forging warriors from raw recruits. My father, still straight-backed despite his 73 years, still carrying himself with the bearing of a man who'd earned every gray hair through service and sacrifice. My mother, whose gentle hands had bandaged more training injuries than she could count, whose fierce eyes had seen through the facades of 1,000 young soldiers trying to prove they were tougher than they really were. They were sitting on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway, like they'd been waiting for hours. Maybe they had been. Parents have a way of knowing when their children are coming home broken, even when those children are middle-aged warriors with decades of their own battles behind them. My father said nothing when he saw the empty holster. His eyes took it in with the quick assessment of a man trained to notice details, but his expression didn't change. He'd seen enough injustice in his time to know that sometimes good men get crushed by systems designed to protect the corrupt. Sometimes honor becomes a liability instead of an asset. My mother, she just touched my shoulder. The same way she'd done the night before my first deployment, when I was young and scared and trying to hide both behind a mask of bravado. Her touch carried the weight of understanding, of unconditional love, of a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with rank or regulation, and everything to do with the unbreakable bonds of family. I thought I was returning home defeated. I thought I was crawling back to lick my wounds and figure out how to rebuild a life from the ashes of my career. I had no idea I'd just walked into the home of two people who'd once trained the very man who'd humiliated me. I didn't know I was about to witness what real honor looks like when it's backed into a corner and forced to fight. That evening, as darkness settled over our small town like a blanket, my mother disappeared into her study. I could hear her moving around in there, opening drawers, rifling through old files, muttering to herself in the way she did when she was solving a particularly difficult problem. My father and I sat in the living room, the silence between us comfortable but heavy with unspoken understanding. When she emerged, she was holding an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. Her face was grim, her eyes burning with a cold fire I hadn't seen since I was a child and some playground bully had made the mistake of targeting her son. "Look at this," she said, placing the clipping on the coffee table between us. It was a photograph from 30 years ago, my mother in her crisp instructor's uniform, standing beside a group of fresh-faced recruits during their graduation ceremony. And there, in the front row, young and eager and full of the idealism that military service was supposed to represent, was Admiral Hayes. Back when he was just another kid trying to prove himself worthy of the uniform. "I remember him," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Jonathan Hayes. Mediocre soldier, excellent politician. Always more concerned with how things looked than how they actually were. I should have failed him then. Should have saved everyone the trouble. My father reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a key I'd never seen before, old brass, worn smooth by decades of handling. Without a word, he walked to the hallway closet and unlocked a footlocker I'd noticed, but never questioned throughout my childhood. Inside were his old military credentials, commendations, letters of recommendation, and there, buried beneath layers of carefully preserved history, was a letter signed by Admiral Hayes' superior from 25 years ago. The letter detailed Hayes' early career infractions, nothing major enough to end his career, but a pattern of behavior that painted a clear picture of a man willing to bend rules and sacrifice others for his own advancement. My father had been involved in the investigation, had recommended disciplinary action that was ultimately waived due to political connections and bureaucratic convenience. They exchanged a look across the room, my parents, these two warriors who'd given their lives to an institution they believed in, who'd raised their son to honor the same values they'd spent decades defending. No words were necessary. The metallic sound of latches snapping open was like the cocking of a weapon. "We didn't speak of revenge. I want you to understand that. This wasn't about payback or settling old scores. They spoke of honor and how it dies only when good men stay silent in the face of corruption. They talked about duty, not just to country or flag, but to the younger generation of soldiers who deserved better than to serve under men like Hayes." My mother's hands were steady as she spread the documents across the table. My father's jaw was set in the way I remembered from childhood, when he was about to tackle a problem that required both intelligence and determination. They'd found their mission, and after 40 years of marriage and military service, they moved with the synchronized precision of a unit that had trained together for decades. I watched them work, torn between anger at what Hayes had done to me and awe at witnessing these two legends come out of retirement for one final operation. The same discipline that had once shaped my own character was now being turned against the man who'd tried to destroy it. Justice was coming, and it was wearing the faces of the two people who'd taught me what honor really meant. The next morning, they moved with the methodical precision of veterans planning their most important mission. My father made coffee at 0500 hours sharp, old habits die hard, while my mother laid out a strategy that would have impressed any general staff. They weren't operating on emotion or impulse. This was calculated, professional, devastating in its thoroughness. Their first stop was the office of Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, an old comrade who'd managed to navigate the political minefield of military bureaucracy without losing his soul. Rodriguez now worked in internal investigations, one of the few clean officers left in a system increasingly corrupted by careerists like Hayes. The meeting was arranged with a simple phone call, no explanations needed, just the coded language of old soldiers who knew when duty called. Rodriguez listened to their presentation with the stone-faced expression of a man who'd seen too much and hoped for too little. But as the evidence mounted, financial irregularities, falsified after-action reports, recommendations for commendations that Hayes had written for himself, his expression darkened. "How long has this been going on?" Rodriguez asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years," my father replied. "Maybe decades. We only scratched the surface." The most damning evidence came from Hayes' time as a company commander in Afghanistan. Classified files that Rodriguez was able to access showed a pattern of abandoning soldiers in dangerous positions when extraction became politically inconvenient. 3 good men had died because Hayes chose optics over operations, career advancement over the lives of the troops under his command. My mother spent the afternoon drafting a comprehensive report that read like an indictment. Every allegation was documented, every claim supported by official records that Hayes himself had signed. She wrote with the precision of someone who'd spent decades evaluating soldiers' fitness for duty, but there was a personal edge to her words that made each sentence cut like a blade. My father, meanwhile, prepared for the more direct aspects of their plan. He cleaned his old service pistol with the same care he'd shown it throughout his career, not because he intended to use it, but because a warrior maintains his weapons regardless of the likelihood of combat. The ritual of cleaning and inspection was meditative, focusing his mind on the confrontation to come. I watched them work throughout that long day, these 2 people who'd shaped my understanding of right and wrong, of duty and honor, of what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. The rain began falling as evening approached, drumming against the windows like the ghost of distant artillery. When they finally left the house, walking to their car with the measured pace of soldiers approaching an objective, I didn't try to stop them. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have insisted on going with them, or talked them out of what they were planning, or found some other way to handle the situation. But some wars, you don't fight alone. Some battles require the wisdom of experience and the fury of righteous anger. Some enemies can only be defeated by people who understand that honor is worth more than career, more than comfort, more than life itself. The sound of their car pulling away was like the final notes of a funeral dirge for my old life. But it was also the opening chord of something new, a reckoning that had been years in the making, justice delayed but not denied, the settling of accounts that should have been balanced long ago. That night, as I sat alone in my childhood home surrounded by the echoes of their preparations, I realized I wasn't just witnessing my parents' final mission. I was seeing the difference between soldiers and warriors, between people who wear the uniform and people who embody its true meaning. Hayes had forgotten that distinction somewhere along his climb up the ladder of rank and privilege. He was about to be reminded in the most devastating way possible. They arrived at the base just after dawn, when the morning mist was still clinging to the buildings and the first formations were beginning their daily routines. My parents drove through those gates with the bearing of people who belonged there, who'd earned their right to walk those halls through decades of faithful service. The guards recognized my father's retired credentials and waved them through with the respect due to a man who'd given his best years to the institution they were all sworn to protect. The base looked different in the early morning light, cleaner somehow, more honest than it had seemed during my public humiliation. Or maybe that was just my perspective, colored by the knowledge of what my parents were carrying in their briefcase and their hearts. They walked through corridors where I'd once jogged during morning PT, past offices where I'd received commendations and assignments, through the administrative heart of a machine that had chewed me up and spit me out. But they weren't there as grieving parents seeking sympathy. They were there as retired military instructors conducting what they called a veteran inspection, a perfectly legitimate exercise of their rights as retired personnel to observe current operations and offer feedback based on their experience. Hayes' secretary, a nervous young corporal who probably spent more time managing his social calendar than his military duties, barely looked up from her computer screen when they announced themselves. "The Admiral is preparing for a briefing," she said without making eye contact. "He doesn't have time for unscheduled." "He'll make time," my mother interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades making teenagers into Marines. "Tell him Colonel Patricia Morrison and Sergeant Major Robert Morrison are here to discuss a matter of urgent institutional importance." The use of their full names and ranks had the desired effect. Even Hayes, corrupt as he was, wasn't stupid enough to refuse a meeting with two legendary instructors whose reputations were known throughout the military community. The corporals scrambled to announce them, and within minutes, they were walking into the lion's den. Hayes' office was a monument to ego, walls covered with photographs of himself shaking hands with politicians, receiving awards, posing with foreign dignitaries. His desk was positioned to catch the morning light in a way that would flatter his features during video conferences. Everything about the space screamed of a man more concerned with appearance than substance, more interested in being seen as important than actually doing important work. He greeted them with the practiced charm of a career politician, offering coffee and comfortable chairs and all the meaningless pleasantries that lubricate the machinery of military bureaucracy. But my father cut through the bullshit with surgical precision, placing a manila envelope on the polished surface of Hayes' desk like a chess player making the opening move of an endgame. "What's this?" Hayes asked, his tones still friendly but with an edge of wariness creeping in. "Open it," my father said simply. Hayes' hands were steady as he broke the seal and pulled out the contents, but I would have given anything to see his face as he realized what he was looking at. Copies of his own falsified reports, financial records showing kickbacks from defense contractors, communication logs that proved he deliberately delayed rescue operations for political reasons. Evidence of corruption so comprehensive and damning that it read like a prosecutor's dream case. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, crackling with tension and the weight of decades of accumulated lies finally coming to light. Hayes tried to maintain his composure, tried to summon the arrogance that had carried him through years of successful deception, but the paper trail was undeniable. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Does it matter?" my mother replied, stepping forward with the grace of a predator closing in for the kill. "The question isn't where we got it. The question is what you're going to do now that your sins have caught up with you." Hayes laughed, actually laughed, like the whole thing was some kind of elaborate joke. "You think you can threaten me? You think these allegations will stick? I have friends in Washington, connections you can't imagine, political capital that." "You humiliated my son to hide your sins," my mother interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You destroyed a good man's career to protect your own reputation. You've spent years sacrificing better soldiers than yourself to advance your pathetic excuse for a career." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting Hayes feel the full weight of his crimes pressing down on him like a collapsed building. "Now the whole nation will see what you really are." That's when Hayes realized the true scope of what was happening. The documents in his hands weren't just evidence, they were copies. The originals were already in the hands of the Inspector General, the FBI, the Washington Post, and every other institution with the power to investigate and expose military corruption. While he'd been sleeping peacefully in his officers' quarters, confident in his ability to destroy careers and silence inconvenient voices, my parents had been systematically dismantling his entire world. His arrogance crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The smooth political operator disappeared, replaced by a desperate man finally understanding that his crimes had consequences. He started shouting threats, denials, promises of retaliation, but his voice just echoed off the walls of his ego shrine like the death cries of a mortally wounded animal. The timing was perfect, surgical in its precision. As Hayes' voice rose to a panicked shriek, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside his office. The base commander arrived with a contingent of military police, summoned by Rodriguez based on the evidence my parents had provided. They weren't there to arrest Hayes, not yet, but their presence made it clear that his days of operating with impunity were over. I can imagine Hayes' voice breaking as he realized that every word he'd spoken in anger was being heard by the very people who would decide his fate. The great manipulator, the master of political theater, reduced to a blubbering caricature of the soldier he'd once pretended to be. The scene must have faded with his protests echoing down the corridor like the last gasps of a dying regime. The news broke 3 days later like a thunderclap across the military community. High-ranking naval officer under investigation for corruption read the headlines, followed by devastating details that made Hayes' crimes impossible to ignore or minimize. The Washington Post ran a front-page story with documents that looked familiar, the same evidence my parents had placed on his desk, now spread across newspaper pages for the entire nation to examine. Cable news picked up the story within hours, and suddenly Hayes' photograph was being displayed next to graphics titled "Military Corruption Scandal" and "Betrayal of Trust." His carefully cultivated image as a dedicated public servant evaporated under the harsh light of investigative journalism, replaced by the reality of a career criminal who'd worn the uniform as camouflage for his crimes. The military's response was swift and decisive, probably because they had no choice, with the evidence spread across every major news outlet in the country. Hayes was suspended pending investigation, stripped of his command authority, and placed under house arrest while federal prosecutors decided whether to pursue criminal charges. His security clearance was revoked, his assets frozen, his legacy transformed from distinguished service to cautionary tale about the corruption of power. But for me, the most important news came in the form of a phone call from Rodriguez himself. "Pack your dress uniform," he said without preamble. "You're being reinstated with full honors and back pay. The Admiral's actions have been declared retaliatory and without merit. Your record is being expunged of any reference to disciplinary action." The ceremony was smaller than the one where I'd been humiliated, but infinitely more meaningful. No crowds of onlookers, no theatrical staging, just a handful of good officers who understood the difference between justice and politics. The base commander, Hayes' replacement, was a career soldier whose reputation for integrity had survived 30 years of military bureaucracy. "What was done to you was wrong," he said as he handed me back my service weapon. "It was a betrayal of everything this uniform is supposed to represent." The weapon felt heavier than I remembered, or maybe I was just more aware of its significance after having it stripped away. The grip was familiar, comfortable in my palm, like shaking hands with an old friend. But there was something new, an engraving on the barrel that hadn't been there before. "Honor cannot be stripped, only tested." I didn't smile when they pinned my insignia back onto my uniform. Vindication doesn't erase humiliation, and justice delayed is still justice that should never have been necessary in the first place. Instead, I saluted my parents, who stood in the back of the room wearing their dress uniforms for the first time in years. They'd earned the right to witness this moment, to see their final mission completed successfully. My mother's eyes were bright with tears, not of joy, exactly, but of satisfaction that justice had finally prevailed over corruption. The weight of what it had cost was visible in her expression, the understanding that victory in this kind of war always comes at a price. But she stood straight and proud, a warrior who'd fought her last battle and won. My father's salute was crisp and perfect, exactly as it had been 40 years earlier when he'd first earned the right to wear the uniform. His face showed no emotion, but I knew him well enough to see the pride lurking behind his stoic expression. He taught me that honor was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth risking everything to defend. Now he'd proven it one final time. The official ceremony lasted 20 minutes, but the real restoration had taken place the moment my parents decided that silence in the face of corruption was its own form of betrayal. They'd reminded everyone present, including me, that the uniform doesn't make the soldier. The soldier's choices determine whether the uniform retains its meaning. Today, I stand before my old base in the California sunshine, watching new recruits go through their training exercises with the same intensity and dedication I once brought to these same grounds. The flag snaps in the ocean breeze exactly as it did on the day Hayes tried to destroy my career, but everything else has changed in ways both subtle and profound. Hayes himself is serving 8 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to charges of corruption, fraud, and dereliction of duty. His court-martial was a media sensation, with each day bringing new revelations about the depth of his crimes and the number of good soldiers whose careers he destroyed to protect his own interests. The judge's sentencing statement became legendary in military circles. You wore the uniform of a warrior while possessing the heart of a coward. But his fate, satisfying as it was, isn't really the point of this story. The Admiral thought punishment could erase a soldier, that public humiliation could destroy the values that had been instilled through decades of training and service. He forgot that those values don't come from rank or position or the approval of corrupt superiors. They come from family, from mentorship, from the unbreakable bonds forged between people who understand that some things are worth more than personal advancement. He also forgot, and this was his fatal mistake, that the blood that trained me ran deeper than his rank. My parents didn't emerge from retirement out of rage or wounded pride or simple desire for revenge. They came back to active duty one final time because they understood something Hayes never learned. Honor isn't something you wear on your sleeve or display on your wall. It's something you carry in your heart and defend with your life when necessary. The lesson isn't that corruption always gets punished, because we all know that's not true. The lesson isn't that justice always prevails, because history is littered with good people who were destroyed by systems designed to protect the corrupt. The lesson is that real power, the kind that lasts, the kind that matters, the kind that can survive any assault, is built on respect rather than rank, on character rather than connections, on the willingness to do what's right even when it costs everything. My parents didn't avenge me out of rage. They reminded Hayes and everyone watching that the uniform was built to protect honor, not the other way around. They showed that sometimes, when the system fails, individuals have to step forward and restore the balance between justice and power. They proved that silence isn't always golden. Sometimes it's just another form of cowardice. The words my father spoke to me on the night before my first deployment still echo through my mind. They can take your weapons, son, but never your aim. I thought I understood what he meant back then, when I was young and eager and convinced that good intentions were enough to change the world. Now I know he was talking about something deeper than firearms or military tactics. He was talking about purpose, about the internal compass that guides a person through the moral ambiguity of a complex world. Hayes took my weapon, stripped my rank, tried to destroy my reputation and my future. But he couldn't touch my aim, my commitment to serving something greater than myself, my understanding of what it means to be a warrior rather than just a soldier, my determination to stand up for what's right even when the cost is higher than I want to pay. That's the difference between people who wear the uniform and people who embody its true meaning. That's why my parents' final mission succeeded where decades of official oversight had failed. That's why honor survived Hayes' attempt to destroy it, why justice eventually caught up with injustice, why the corrupt politician ended up in prison while the soldiers he'd tried to destroy continued serving with their heads held high. If this story reminded you that real power is built on respect rather than rank, that character matters more than connections, that sometimes silence isn't golden but just another form of surrender, then you understand something important about the world we're living in. You understand that corruption thrives in darkness and dies in the light of exposure. Hit that like button if you believe that good people have a responsibility to stand up to corruption, even when it's wearing a uniform and hiding behind institutional authority. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that prove silence doesn't mean surrender, that justice delayed isn't always justice denied, that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're fighting for something greater than themselves. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because geography doesn't matter when we're talking about honor and courage and the willingness to do what's right. Whether you're watching from New York or Nebraska, California or Carolina, the principles are the same. The choice between standing up and staying silent is universal. Because somewhere out there, right now, another soldier is standing at attention while a corrupt superior tries to destroy their career for political convenience. Another family is watching their child's dreams get crushed by a system that's supposed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Another good person is wondering whether speaking truth to power is worth the inevitable retaliation. This story is for them. It's proof that corruption isn't invincible, that bullies in uniform are still just bullies, that sometimes the people who seem powerless are actually the most dangerous enemies injustice can face. It's evidence that honor isn't dead, it's just waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right cause to bring it back to life. My parents are both gone now, taken by time and age and the accumulated weight of lives spent in service to others. But their final mission continues through stories like this one, through every person who refuses to stay silent when good people are being destroyed by corrupt systems, through every family that understands that love sometimes means fighting for justice even when the odds seem impossible. They taught me that they can take your weapon, but never your aim. Hayes learned that lesson the hard way, from a federal prison cell where he has 8 years to contemplate the difference between wearing a uniform and earning the right to wear it. The war between honor and corruption never ends. It just moves to new battlefields, finds new warriors, tests new generations of people who have to choose between comfort and conscience. But as long as there are parents willing to come out of retirement for one final mission, as long as there are families who understand that some things are worth fighting for, as long as there are people who believe that silence in the face of injustice is its own form of betrayal, honor will survive. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very determined and very willing to pay the price that justice demands, honor will win. That's not just a story about my family or my career or one corrupt admiral who forgot what the uniform was supposed to represent. That's a promise about what's possible when good people refuse to surrender, when justice finds its voice, when the powerful learn that their power has limits that can't be crossed without consequences. Hit that subscribe button. Share this story. Tell the world that honor isn't dead. It's just waiting for its next assignment.